California's Proposition 19, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you'll see why I break it down into those three different categories here in a minute. So Proposition 19 was passed by voters in November of 2020, and it was marketed as home protection for seniors, severely disabled families, and then victims of wildfires and natural disasters. But there's a lot more to Proposition 19 than just that, just what people voted on. That's why I have the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, I do want to give you a little legal disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a financial advisor. This is simply my take on Proposition 19. So here we go. Okay, the good part of Proposition 19. If you're over 55 years old or you're severely disabled, victim of a wildfire, natural disaster, you can transfer your current low property taxes to a new primary residence anywhere in the state of California. Now that changed the way that it used to be, because it used to be that there were only certain counties where you could transfer the property tax from your old property to a new one in a different county. This made it statewide. So that's a good part of it. And if the new property that you purchase is of equal or lesser value, this is your primary residence, if it's equal or lesser value, the property taxes stay at the same old low rate. Now there's some caveats as you see on the screen here, 5% and 10%, and we'll go into those a little bit later. Now, if you buy a more expensive property, then the difference in value between the old home and the new one is going to be added to your current property taxes. And then the administrative part of this is you can only transfer those property taxes up to 3 times in your life. Okay, let's give a real life example. You're over 55 years old and you're going to buy a new primary residence and then transfer that property tax from the old primary residence to the new one. So let's use a real life example. Let's say that you purchased your mid-peninsula house for $300,000 in 1989. And that is a true value. The average sales price in 1989 of a single family home on the mid-San Francisco Peninsula was approximately $300,000. And under Proposition 13, now let me stop for a minute. Proposition 13 came before Proposition 19. Proposition 19 amended and expanded some of the provisions of Proposition 13. So Proposition 13 is still there, but Proposition 19 is kind of layered on top of that. Under Proposition 19, property taxes can increase by a maximum of 2% per year. So if you take that $300,000 home you bought in 1989, tax-wise, property tax-wise, its value has now risen to approximately $600,000. But that's your tax value. But let's assume that your current market value, the potential sales price of your property is around $2.5 million. And this is a realistic scenario. That $300,000 home in 1989 now would sell for approximately $2.5 million in 2025, which is when I'm filming this here on the San Francisco Peninsula. Okay, so let's look at this scenario. Let's say that you buy a replacement home. So you're buying a replacement home before you sell your old one. If you buy a replacement home for $2.5 million or less, and then you sell your old home for $2.5 million, your property taxes stay the same. Well, let's just say your philosophy is, hey, you know, I've worked hard for a very long time. I want a little more luxury. I want some more amenities and maybe a more updated home. I'm going to step up to $3 million. So if you buy the new home for $3 million and you sell your old home for $2.5 million, your property taxes will increase. And since that new property price is $500,000 more than the old one, that amount, that $500,000 difference is going to be added to the taxable value of the old property. So let's take a look at the math here. Okay, $600,000 taxable value of an old home. You're going to add to that the $500,000 difference between the sales price of the old home and the purchase price of the new one. That's going to give you a $1.1 million new taxable value. So your old property taxes were $7,500. You're going to take your $600,000 property taxable value of the property times 1.25%. Now, where do we get the 1.25%? Well, in the state of California, property taxes on real estate are 1% as a base. But each locality has local assessments. Maybe that's a sewer bond or something that gets added onto it. I use 1.25% because we're shooting this in San Mateo County, which is on the mid San Francisco Peninsula. Our property taxes are 1.25% approximately. So the property tax on the old house are $7,500. Your new property, the property tax is going to be $13,750 because your taxable value has stepped up to $1.1 million. So essentially, you're going to be paying $6,250 more in property taxes than you did with your old lower priced property. So you can strategize and actually go up higher in pricing and still keep the same old property taxes. And what you're going to do is you're going to sell your old property first, and then you're going to buy a new one. One day after, up to 1 year after you sell the old one, you can go up in purchase price by 5% over the old sales price. You can do that even more if you buy your new property 1 year and 1 day up to 2 years after you sell the old property. You can go up in purchase price by 10% and still keep the old low property taxes. So let's look at the math on that. If you sell your old property first and then you buy a new one 1 day after up to 1 year after, you can go up by 5%. So if you sold your old home for $2.5 million and then you buy a replacement home for $2.625 million or less, it's essentially 5% more, $125,000 more. Your property taxes stay at the same old low rate. Let's look at the 10% scenario. Okay, so again, you sold your old property first, you're going to buy a new one, sell the old property for $2.5 million. You can buy that replacement home 1 day and 1 year and 1 day up to 2 years after, go up by 10% or $250,000. So you can essentially buy a new property at $2.75 million and still keep the old low property tax rate. Okay, that is how the good part of Proposition 19 works, and that's what mainly people voted on. Proposition 19, the bad. Now, you'll understand why I call this the bad. This deals with parent to child or grandparent to grandchild transfers. Now, it had to have been the primary residence or the family farm, and then for a grandparent to a grandchild transfer, the parents have to have been deceased. So essentially, you're skipping a generation. That child or grandchild is going to be able to keep the same low property taxes unless the current market value, remember I want to stress market value, not taxable value, unless the current market value is $1 million more than the parent-grandchild taxable value. And if the current market value is more than 1 million over the old taxable value, and then that amount, that difference is added to the current taxes. Okay, and the other caveat to that is the child or grandchild must live in the property within 1 year of death. And then an administrative part of this is that you must file for the exclusion within 3 years of the death of the parent or grandparent. Okay, so let's look at a scenario here. Okay, under Proposition 13, and remember Proposition 13 came first. Proposition 19 expanded and modified some of the provisions of Proposition 13. But under Proposition 13, property taxes can increase by 2% max every year. So if we get back to the 1989 scenario, average sales price of a single-family home on the San Francisco Peninsula was approximately $300,000. The taxable value, the property taxable value of that property has risen to $600,000 in 2025, which is when I'm shooting this video. As an example of that, at the time of the property tax transfer, a parent's house has a taxable value of $600,000 and a fair market value of $2.5 million. So essentially it could sell on the open market for $2.5 million. So we're going to take, and this math gets a little complicated, we're going to take the $600,000 taxable value plus the $1 million Proposition 19 allowance or Proposition 19 exclusion. That gives us a total excluded amount of $1.6 million. Okay, so if that home, say a kid inherits the home from the parents after the parents pass away. If that home had a market value of $1.6 million or less, the child would not have to pay any additional property tax over what his parents were paying, his or her parents. But since the market value of the home is greater than the excluded amount of $1.6 million, the child would have an increase in property taxes. And that is a shocker for a lot of people, because a lot of people assumed, hey, my parents worked long and hard. They had this really nice big home in a really nice neighborhood. I'd love to live there. They passed away. I think I can move into it and keep the same property taxes, but you can't. So let's look at the math on that. Okay, so since the fair market value is greater than the excluded amount, there is going to be an increase in property taxes. So we're going to take the $2.5 million fair market value minus the $1.6 million excluded amount. You've got a $900,000 difference. So how much is that new property tax? So we're going to take the $600,000 old taxable value plus the $900,000 difference. And remember, 2.5 million minus the 1.6 excluded amount, that's how we come up with the $900,000 difference. The new taxable value for the kids that have moved into the deceased parent's home, the new taxable value is going to be $1.5 million. Well, we look at what the parents were paying, the $600,000 times the 1.25% tax rate for San Mateo County. The child's parents were paying $7,500 a year in property taxes. Well, now, with that $1.5 million new taxable value, the kids are going to be paying $18,750. So essentially, the kids have seen their tax rate go up by $11,250 over what their parents were paying. That has prevented some children from actually being able to move into the parents' home and keep it because they just can't afford the taxes. So that was an unintended consequence of Proposition 19. Now we move on to the ugly part of Proposition 19. This deals with rental property, income property. If mom or dad or grandma or grandpa pass away and they leave the child or grandchild a rental property, that property will, and you notice I have that in bold, will be reassessed at the current market value. This is a big shocker for many people who didn't realize what they were voting for on Proposition 19. That's it. I could stop right here and you would understand the significance, the negative significance of this. So let's look at some details here. Okay, mom or dad and grandpa, they pass away, they leave their rental property to a child or grandchild. So let's give a real life example. Let's go back to 1989, like we did in one of our other examples. 1989, the average fourplex on the mid-peninsula, the mid-San Francisco Peninsula, was around $600,000. Under Proposition 13, property taxes could have increased every year by up to 2%. So the property taxable value of that fourplex has now risen to $1.2 million in 2025. And again, that's when I'm filming this. Let's look at some examples here. Mom and dad or grandma and grandpa pass away. They leave their child or their grandchild a rental property. So let's use a real life example. The parents or grandparents, they purchased a mid-peninsula fourplex for $600,000 in 1989. That's a realistic number. 1989, that was the average sales price on the mid-peninsula for a fourplex. Under Proposition 13, the property taxes could have gone up by a maximum 2% every year. So the taxable value of that $600,000 fourplex now has risen to $1.2 million in 2025. But the current market value, the sales value essentially of that fourplex is $3 million. So the taxable value, as we said, is $1.2 million. So the property taxes on that grandma or grandpa were paying would be approximately $15,000 per year. Now, if the children want to keep that property and keep renting it out, their property taxes are going to go up to $37,500. Again, that's because the market value, which is how the property taxes are calculated, the market value is $3 million. So $37,500 in property tax minus $15,000, which is what the parents were paying. The kids' property taxes on that property have gone up by $22,500. Now, the unfortunate part of that is many of these parents or grandparents who bought these fourplexes, in our example, many of them who bought these properties many years ago, they had tenants, long-term tenants living in them, and some of them never raised the rent on those tenants. Well, now the kids, they inherit the property taxes go up, the rents are really low, and in California we do have limits on how much a landlord can raise the rent. So now these kids are faced with a situation that they can't raise the rent enough to cover the additional property taxes, and therefore they're forced to sell. Now, what happens in that scenario? You have perhaps a developer that's going to tear the property down or gut it, fix it up, and then resell it at a much higher price or re-rent it at a much higher price. Those tenants, those long-term tenants that were in that property, are now displaced. So the family loses that asset, the benefit of that rental property, and those tenants who were like family now have to move somewhere else and pay a higher rent simply because people did not realize what they were voting for when they voted in Proposition 19. So if you're confused about Proposition 19, or you would like to see if you could help make some changes, either DM me or go to the website on the screen here, forcalifornians.com. So this is Chris Eckert. This is my take on Proposition 19. Have a great day.